Did cowboys actually have gunfights? The mundane, dusty reality of life on a long cattle drive. The myth of the gunfighting cowboy. Imagine, for a moment, the American West as it appears in countless movies and television shows. A dusty street stretches through a frontier town. Wooden buildings lie on either side of the road. The afternoon sun hangs high in the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a piano plays inside a saloon. Suddenly, two men step into the street. The town falls silent. Shopkeepers stop what they are doing. Horses stand quietly beside hitching posts. A tumbleweed rolls across the road. The two men stare at one another. Their hands hover near their revolvers. Seconds later, gunfire erupts. One man falls. The other walks away. For more than a century, scenes like this have helped define the image of the American cowboy. The cowboy of popular culture is tough, fearless, independent, and always ready for a gunfight. He rides across endless plains, settles disputes with a revolver, and lives according to his own code. It is one of the most recognizable characters in world history. Even people who have never visited the United States often recognize the image instantly. The cowboy hat, the leather boots, the revolver, the horse, the lonely figure riding across a vast landscape. Yet the real story of the cowboy is very different. The truth is not necessarily more exciting. In fact, it is often much quieter. But it is also far more interesting. Most cowboys were not gunfighters. Most cowboys were workers. They woke before sunrise. They spent long days in the saddle. They cared for cattle. They repaired equipment. They crossed rivers. They endured storms. They battled dust, heat, insects, and exhaustion. And many of them spent far more time worrying about cattle than they ever spent thinking about guns. The famous gunfighting cowboy largely emerged from popular fiction. During the late 19th century, cheap publications known as dime novels became extremely popular. These stories were filled with dramatic adventures. Heroes fought bandits. Lawmen confronted outlaws. Cowboys engaged in thrilling shootouts. The stories sold well because they were exciting. Readers loved tales of danger and adventure. The problem was that excitement often mattered more than accuracy. Writers quickly learned that ordinary ranch work was not nearly as thrilling as a dramatic duel in the middle of town. As a result, fictional cowboys became larger than life. They performed impossible feats. They survived countless gunfights. They defeated villains with remarkable speed and skill. Over time, these fictional characters became more famous than the real workers who inspired them. The arrival of motion pictures only strengthened the myth. Early Western films became enormously popular. Audiences watched heroes ride across the frontier, fighting criminals and defending innocent settlers. The formula worked. People enjoyed the action. Studios continued producing westerns year after year. By the middle of the 20th century, millions of viewers around the world believed they understood cowboy life. Many had seen hundreds of fictional gunfights. Very few had seen a realistic depiction of a cattle drive. Before dawn on the trail. Long before the first light appeared above the horizon, the camp was already beginning to stir. The American frontier could be surprisingly quiet before dawn. The stars still hung overhead. The prairie stretched endlessly into darkness. The air was cool, sometimes even cold, depending on the season. Nearby, thousands of cattle rested across the open range. Occasionally, a low moo drifted through the darkness. A horse stamped its hoof. A saddle creaked. A distant coyote called somewhere beyond the herd. For the Cowboys, another day of work was about to begin. Unlike the heroes of Western movies, real cowboys rarely woke up to adventure. Instead, they woke up to responsibility. A cattle drive operated according to routine. The herd needed constant supervision. Every day followed a similar pattern. The success of the entire journey depended upon discipline and consistency. Many cowboys rose well before sunrise. Sleeping late was not an option. Thousands of animals had to be moved, managed, and protected. The day began when darkness still covered the plains. One of the first people awake was often the cook. The chuck wagon served as the heart of the traveling camp. Introduced during the great cattle drives, the chuck wagon carried food, cooking supplies, tools, medical supplies, and many of the necessities required for life on the trail. Before most cowboys opened their eyes, the cook was already at work. A fire crackled in the darkness. Coffee began to brew. The smell slowly drifted across the sleeping camp. For many cowboys, that smell signaled the beginning of another long day. Coffee occupied an almost legendary status on the cattle trails. Historical accounts repeatedly mention how much coffee cowboys consumed. A hot cup provided comfort during cold mornings. It offered energy after restless nights. And perhaps most importantly, it became part of the daily routine. Breakfast was rarely luxurious. Cowboys were not enjoying elaborate frontier feasts every morning. Instead, meals focused on practicality. Beans were common. Biscuits were common. Salt pork appeared frequently. Sometimes dried fruit could be obtained. Occasionally there might be beef. The goal was simple. Provide enough calories to support hard physical labor. The meal did not need to be exciting. It needed to be filling. As dawn slowly approached, more members of the crew emerged from their blankets. Many had slept directly on the ground. Others used simple bedrolls. Comfort was limited. Dust found its way into nearly everything. Blankets became dirty. Clothing became dirty. The endless march of the herd. By mid-morning, the cool air of dawn had disappeared. The sun climbed steadily higher above the prairie. What had seemed pleasant and refreshing only a few hours earlier now began to feel warm. Soon, it would feel hot. For the cowboys, this marked the beginning of the longest part of the day. The herd was moving. Thousands of cattle stretched across the grasslands like a slow-moving river of horns, hooves, and dust. The journey would continue for miles before the animals were allowed to rest again. To an outside observer, the work might have appeared simple. The cattle moved forward. The cowboys rode alongside. Nothing dramatic seemed to happen. Yet beneath this seemingly ordinary scene existed a constant struggle to maintain order. A cattle drive required patience. More patience than most people today can easily imagine. Hour after hour, the herd moved forward at a slow pace. The speed was carefully controlled. Move too quickly and the cattle could become exhausted. Move too slowly and valuable time would be lost. The trail boss constantly balanced these competing concerns. Every decision affected the success of the journey. The cattle themselves were not always cooperative. Some animals wandered away from the herd. Others became stubborn. A few seemed determined to create problems whenever possible. Experienced cowboys learned to recognize these troublesome animals. They often knew which cattle required extra attention. Managing thousands of animals demanded observation and skill. One careless mistake could create chaos. Dust quickly became one of the greatest challenges. As thousands of hooves struck the ground, enormous clouds of dust rose into the air. The farther back a cowboy rode, the worse the conditions became. Some riders spent entire days breathing dust. It covered their hats. It coated their clothes. It settled on their skin. It found its way into food, blankets, and equipment. There was no escaping it. Many cowboys later described dust as one of the most constant companions of life on the trail. The heat added another layer of discomfort. During summer drives, temperatures could become oppressive. The sun beat down relentlessly from above. Shade was often difficult to find. Large sections of the Great Plains offered little protection from the elements. For hours at a time, cowboys remained exposed to the sun. Sweat soaked their clothing. Faces became weathered. Skin darkened beneath months of outdoor labor. Yet the herd continued moving. The work continued. Stopping was rarely an option. Water became increasingly important as the day progressed. The cattle required water. The horses required water. The cowboys required water. Finding suitable watering locations became a critical responsibility. A poorly planned route could create serious problems. Fortunately, experienced trail bosses understood the landscape. Many knew where rivers, streams, and reliable water sources could be found. This knowledge often proved invaluable. Meanwhile, the sounds of the cattle drive filled the prairie. The low calls of cattle. The rhythmic pounding of hooves. The creaking of leather saddles. The occasional shout of a cowboy guiding the herd. These sounds formed the soundtrack of everyday life on the trail. There was no dramatic music. No heroic speeches. Just the steady sounds of work. Hour after hour. Mile after mile. The monotony could be exhausting. Many people imagine the frontier as a place of constant excitement. For real cowboys, boredom was often a far greater challenge. Days frequently passed without rivers, mud, and the obstacles of the trail. By the time a cattle drive had been underway for several days or even weeks, the cowboys knew that the greatest challenges rarely came from outlaws. More often, danger arrived in the form of the landscape itself. The American frontier was vast. It was beautiful. But it could also be unforgiving. Every mile of the journey presented new obstacles. Some were small. Others threatened the success of the entire drive. Among the most feared were rivers. At first glance, a river might appear harmless. The water flowed quietly. The banks seemed manageable. The crossing looked straightforward. Yet appearances could be deceptive. A river that appeared calm from a distance might conceal deep channels, strong currents, slippery banks, or hidden debris beneath the surface. Crossing a herd of cattle was never simple. Thousands of animals had to move together. One frightened animal could create confusion. Several frightened animals could create chaos. And chaos near water could quickly become dangerous. The trail boss usually inspected a crossing carefully before allowing the herd to proceed. Experienced leaders understood that rushing into a river could end in disaster. The depth of the water had to be evaluated. Life around the campfire, food, stories, and rare moments of rest. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and darkness slowly settled across the prairie, the pace of life on the cattle trail finally began to slow. The cattle had been gathered for the night. The horses had been cared for. The day's work was largely complete. For the Cowboys, this was one of the few moments when they could briefly relax. The campfire became the center of life after sunset. Its warm glow could be seen from a distance across the dark prairie. After spending an entire day in the saddle, many cowboys looked forward to this simple comfort. There were no restaurants, no hotels, no entertainment venues, no electric lights. The campfire served many purposes at once. It provided warmth. It provided light. It provided a place to eat. And perhaps most importantly, it provided companionship. Life on the trail could be lonely. Many cattle drives lasted weeks or even months. The same small group of men worked together every day. They faced the same hardships. They shared the same challenges. Around the campfire, they shared stories as well. The cook remained one of the busiest people in camp. Throughout the day, he had traveled with the chuck wagon. Now he prepared the evening meal. No cowboy expected luxury. The food was simple. But after a long day of hard labor, simple food could taste wonderful. Beans appeared frequently. So did biscuits. Salt pork was common. Coffee was nearly guaranteed. Occasionally there might be fresh beef. Sometimes dried fruit. Sometimes preserved foods brought along for the journey. The menu rarely changed dramatically. Yet most cowboys were simply grateful to eat. A hungry worker seldom complained about a hot meal. As supper ended, conversations began. Stories drifted through the darkness. Some cowboys discussed earlier drives. Others talked about distant towns. Many shared humorous incidents from life on the trail. Exaggeration was common. A small event often became a large adventure when retold around the fire. Laughter occasionally echoed across the prairie. These moments helped break the monotony of trail life. The stories also served another purpose. They passed knowledge from experienced cowboys to younger ones. Lessons about weather. Lessons about horses. Lessons about cattle. Lessons about survival. The frontier possessed few classrooms. Much of what a cowboy learned came directly from other cowboys. Knowledge traveled through conversation. Sometimes the stories involved famous figures of the West. Outlaws, lawmen, ranch owners, frontier legends. Yet even these tales often sounded different when told by working cowboys. The reality was usually less glamorous than the legends suggested. Most cowboys understood that everyday life involved much more work than adventure. Music occasionally appeared around the campfire as well. Some cowboys carried simple instruments. Others preferred singing. The open prairie often carried sound for great distances. A song performed beside the fire could drift into the darkness beyond the camp. Music provided comfort. It reminded men of home. It eased loneliness. And it helped create a sense of community among people living far from settled towns. Despite these moments of relaxation, responsibilities never completely disappeared. The cattle still required supervision. Night guards had to be assigned. Throughout the night, certain cowboys remained awake while others slept. These guards rode slowly around the resting herd. Their task was simple but important. Keep the cattle calm. Watch for danger. Prevent stampedes. A peaceful night could quickly become chaotic if the herd became frightened. For this reason, someone always remained on duty. The system allowed each cowboy to obtain at least some rest. Sleep was valuable. Perhaps more valuable than anything else after weeks on the trail. Most cowboys slept on bedrolls placed directly on the ground. Luxury was almost non-existent. A blanket. A coat. Perhaps a saddle used as a pillow. That was often enough. The prairie itself became the bedroom. Above them stretched an enormous sky filled with stars. Far from city lights, the night sky appeared spectacular. Countless stars glittered overhead. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness. Many cowboys later remembered these views for the rest of their lives. The frontier could be harsh. But it could also be beautiful. Some nights remained perfectly calm. Others brought wind. Some brought rain. Occasionally storms rolled across the plains during the night. The weather did not care whether the cowboys wished to sleep. Nature followed its own schedule. Yet exhaustion usually won. After riding all day, most cowboys fell asleep quickly. Morning would arrive soon enough. Another day of work awaited. As the campfire gradually burned lower, conversations faded. One by one, the cowboys settled into their blankets. The cook finished his tasks. The horses stood quietly nearby. The cattle rested across the prairie. Only the night guards remained fully awake. They rode slowly through the darkness, listening for anything unusual. A distant coyote. A sudden movement. The first rumble of thunder. The responsibilities of the trail never completely disappeared. Yet compared to the long hours spent managing cattle beneath the sun, these evening moments felt peaceful. They offered a brief opportunity to recover. A brief opportunity to laugh. A brief opportunity to remember life beyond the trail. Tomorrow the routine would begin again. Before dawn, coffee would brew. Horses would be saddled. The herd would move forward. The long journey would continue. But for now, beneath a sky crowded with stars, the cowboys enjoyed one of the rare luxuries of frontier life. A few quiet hours beside the campfire. The long evening on the prairie. As the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, a different mood settled over the cattle drive. The hardest work of the day was usually over. The cattle had been moved. The camp had been established. Supper had been eaten. For a short time, the pace of life slowed. The endless motion of the trail gave way to a period of quiet reflection. The prairie itself seemed to change as evening approached. The bright colors of afternoon gradually softened. Long shadows stretched across the grasslands. The heat of the day slowly faded. A cool breeze sometimes drifted across the open country. After hours spent beneath the relentless sun, the change was welcome. Cowboys often used this time to repair equipment. A worn saddle strap might need attention. A piece of tack could require mending. Clothing damaged during the day's work might be patched. Small problems, if ignored, often became larger problems later. Life on the trail encouraged practicality. There were few opportunities to replace broken equipment. What a cowboy carried was often all he had. Others spent the evening caring for their horses. A good horse was more than transportation. It was a partner. The success of a cattle drive depended heavily upon the quality of the horses involved. Cowboys checked hooves, examined saddles, made sure their animals received water and rest. The relationship between rider and horse was one of the most important aspects of frontier life. As darkness slowly approached, conversations often became more relaxed. Stories were shared. Jokes were exchanged. Memories from previous cattle drives were recalled. Many cowboys spent long periods away from family and friends. The men around the campfire formed a temporary community. Trust mattered. Dependability mattered. Every member of the crew relied upon the others. The vastness of the prairie encouraged thoughtfulness. There were few distractions. No newspapers arriving every hour. No telephones. No radios. Only distance, sky, weather, and time. For some cowboys, the evening offered a rare opportunity for reflection. Thoughts drifted toward home, toward family members left behind, toward future plans. The long cattle drives provided plenty of time for contemplation. As twilight deepened, the horizon became increasingly beautiful. Night watch under the stars. As the last conversations around the campfire faded into silence, another phase of the day quietly began. For most cowboys, it was time to sleep. For a few, however, the night's work was only beginning. The herd could not simply be left alone until morning. Thousands of cattle rested across the prairie. Most were calm. Most were tired after a long day of travel. But cattle were unpredictable animals. Something could disturb them at any moment. A strange noise. A sudden gust of wind. A distant thunderclap. The scent of a predator. Any of these might create nervousness within the herd. And nervousness sometimes led to disaster. For this reason, night guards remained on duty while others slept. These men rode slowly around the resting cattle throughout the darkness. The work required patience. There was little excitement. Hours often passed without anything unusual happening. Yet everyone understood the importance of the task. A peaceful night was never guaranteed. The prairie after dark felt like a different world. During the day, the landscape seemed endless. The horizon stretched in every direction. Grasslands rolled beneath the bright sun. At night, visibility disappeared. The world shrank. The campfire glowed softly in the distance. Beyond its light, darkness covered the plains. The night guard relied upon hearing as much as sight. The sounds of the herd became familiar. The occasional movement of cattle. The rustle of grass. The creak of saddle leather. The steady footsteps of a horse. Anything unusual immediately attracted attention. Experienced cowboys learned to recognize subtle changes. A restless herd sounded different from a relaxed herd. A frightened animal behaved differently from a calm one. These observations could provide valuable warning before problems developed. The loneliness of night duty could be considerable. Hours passed slowly. The stars moved overhead. The temperature gradually dropped. Many cowboys spent these quiet moments thinking. Some thought about family. Others thought about towns they hoped to visit once the drive ended. Some simply focused on staying awake. Fatigue remained a constant challenge. The day had already been long. Now more hours of responsibility stretched ahead. To help calm the cattle, many night guards sang softly. This practice may seem unusual to modern audiences. Yet historical accounts mention it repeatedly. The purpose was not entertainment. The purpose was reassurance. The cattle became accustomed to the sound of human voices. A familiar melody helped create a sense of calm. The songs were often simple, slow, gentle. The words drifted across the darkness while the rider moved quietly among the herd. Some cowboys later recalled these moments with surprising affection. There was something peaceful about riding beneath a sky filled with stars while singing softly to resting cattle. The prairie seemed vast beyond imagination. The Milky Way stretched overhead. Countless stars filled the heavens. Far from cities, the night sky appeared extraordinarily bright. For many cowboys, it was one of the most memorable aspects of frontier life. Yet beauty did not eliminate danger. Thunderstorms remained a constant concern. A distant flash of lightning could immediately attract attention. Storms often developed rapidly on the Great Plains. One moment the sky appeared calm. The next, dark clouds gathered along the horizon. Nighttime storms were particularly troubling. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief flashes. Thunder rolled across the prairie. Wind swept through the grass. The cattle became restless. Every rider understood the risk. A frightened herd could become a stampede within moments. As storms approached, vigilance increased. The night guards watched carefully. The trail boss remained alert. Everyone hoped the herd would remain calm. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. Even without storms, unexpected events occasionally occurred. A coyote's cry. A running animal. The sudden movement of part of the herd. Each required investigation. Most turned out to be harmless. But nobody could afford to ignore potential warning signs. The consequences of a mistake could be severe. Hours passed slowly. Midnight arrived. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. The prairie remained quiet. The stars continued their journey across the sky. The cattle rested. The riders waited. Patience was essential. Many people imagined cowboys constantly engaged in action. The reality was often the opposite. Night duty involved long periods of observation, careful listening, quiet movement, endless patience. In many ways, it represented the true nature of cowboy work. Responsibility without recognition, effort without excitement, dedication to a task that rarely attracted attention when performed correctly. Eventually, the darkest hours of the night arrived. For many people, these hours felt longest. Fatigue grew heavier. The camp remained silent. Even the cattle seemed half asleep. Yet the night guards continued their slow circles around the herd. Then, almost imperceptibly, the eastern horizon began to change. Darkness softened. A faint glow appeared. Morning approached once again. The stars gradually faded. Shapes emerged from the darkness. The prairie returned. Another night had passed successfully. The herd remained intact. The cattle remained calm. No stampede had occurred. No disaster had interrupted the drive. For the night guards, this represented success. The best nights were often the most uneventful. Soon the camp would awaken. Coffee would begin brewing. Cowboys would emerge from their blankets. Horses would be saddled. The cattle would begin moving once more. And another long day on the trail would begin beneath the rising sun. But for a brief moment, as dawn spread across the prairie, the men who had guarded the herd through the darkness could finally relax. Their watch was over, and the endless journey continued. Reaching the railheads, the end of the long journey. After weeks, and sometimes months, on the trail, a subtle feeling began to spread through the herd and among the men guiding it. The end was finally approaching. For a cowboy on a cattle drive, reaching a railhead was more than simply arriving at a destination. It meant that the long journey was nearly over. The endless days in the saddle, the dust, the storms, the river crossings, the sleepless nights standing watch over restless cattle. All of it had been leading toward this moment. Somewhere ahead lay a railroad town. A place where the cattle could be sold and loaded onto trains. A place where money would finally change hands. A place where the mundane, dusty reality payday, saloons, and life in frontier towns. For weeks, perhaps even months, the cowboys had lived according to the rhythms of the trail. They woke before sunrise. They spent long hours in the saddle. They crossed rivers, endured storms, watched over cattle through the darkness. Now, at last, the drive was over. The herd had reached the railhead. The cattle had been delivered. And for the first time in many weeks, the cowboys found themselves free from their daily responsibilities. One of the first things on their minds was payday. Cowboys did not earn enormous sums of money. Hollywood often portrays them as adventurous heroes living exciting lives. The reality was much more ordinary. Most cowboys worked long hours for modest wages. The exact amount varied depending on the time period, the ranch, and the nature of the work. Yet few became wealthy. Cowboying was a job. Demanding, exhausting, and often poorly paid. Still, after weeks on the trail, receiving wages felt rewarding. The money represented months of effort. It represented every dusty mile, every sleepless night, every river crossing, every storm endured beneath the open sky. For a brief moment, the hardships of the journey seemed worthwhile. Once paid, many cowboys headed into town. After spending so much time in isolation, frontier towns felt lively and exciting. The streets were often crowded. Wagons rattled over dirt roads. Merchants displayed goods in shop windows. Railroad workers moved through the town. Travelers arrived and departed. The energy contrasted sharply with the quiet solitude of the prairie. One of the simplest pleasures was a proper meal. Trail food had served its purpose. Beans, biscuits, salt pork, coffee, day after day, week after week. Many cowboys dreamed of greater variety. A restaurant meal, however simple, could feel luxurious. Fresh bread, vegetables, pie, stew. These ordinary foods sometimes felt extraordinary after a long cattle drive. Another attraction was the bathhouse. Modern audiences often underestimate how appealing a hot bath could be. Life on the trail was dusty. Very dusty. Dust-covered clothing. Dust-covered equipment. Dust-covered faces and hands. Weeks of travel left their mark. A bathhouse offered the opportunity to wash away the evidence of the journey. For many cowboys, this was among the most appreciated comforts in town. Barbershops were also popular. Hair could be trimmed. Beards could be shaved. The transformation from trail-worn cowboy to reasonably presentable citizen sometimes occurred surprisingly quickly. Of course, no discussion of frontier towns would be complete without mentioning saloons. Popular culture often places saloons at the center of Western life. There is some truth to this. Saloons were common gathering places. People visited them to socialize, to relax, to hear news, to escape boredom. Yet the reality was often less dramatic than movies suggest. Many evenings passed without gunfights or major disturbances. People talked, played cards, shared stories, listened to music, conducted business. In many respects, a saloon functioned as a community center. Cowboys who had spent weeks speaking only to fellow trail hands suddenly found themselves surrounded by strangers. News traveled through these conversations. Information about jobs, about ranches, about weather, about distant towns. The frontier possessed few reliable communication networks. Word of mouth remained important. A conversation in a saloon might provide information unavailable anywhere else. Some cowboys spent their earnings quickly. Others were more cautious. The future remained uncertain. Work could be seasonal. Employment was never guaranteed. Saving money was often difficult but sensible. Not every cowboy managed to do so. Human nature has changed very little over the centuries. The excitement of reaching town occasionally encouraged impulsive decisions. Meanwhile, the town itself continued its daily routines. Merchants sold supplies. Railroads transported goods. Hotels welcomed travelers. Blacksmiths repaired equipment. Businesses thrived because of the constant movement of people and cattle across the frontier. The cattle industry helped sustain many western towns. Without the herds arriving from Texas and elsewhere, some communities might never have flourished. Yet change was already underway. The railroad network continued expanding. New settlements appeared. Fences became more common. The open range slowly began shrinking. The world of the cowboy was evolving. Few people fully understood how dramatic these changes would become. For the moment, however, the cowboys focused on the present. The trail was finished. The cattle had been delivered. The responsibility was over. For a short time, there was an opportunity to enjoy the comforts of town life. A good meal. A hot bath. A clean bed. Friendly conversation. Simple pleasures that felt extraordinary after weeks on the open prairie. Soon enough, many would return to work. Another cattle drive. Another ranch. Another long journey beneath the endless western sky. But for now, they could rest. The trail was behind them. And the frontier town welcomed them, however briefly, back into civilization. The end of the open range. As the 19th century drew toward its final decades, the world of the cowboy began to change. For a brief period, the great cattle drives had seemed unstoppable. Millions of cattle moved north from Texas. Railroad towns flourished. The open prairie appeared endless. To many people, it seemed that this way of life might continue forever. But history rarely stands still. The very forces that helped create the cattle drive era would eventually help bring it to an end. One of the most important changes came in the form of a simple invention: barbed wire. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable. A strand of wire. Sharp metal barbs placed at regular intervals. Nothing about it seemed revolutionary. Yet its impact on the American West was enormous. Before barbed wire became widespread, much of the prairie remained open. Cattle could roam across vast distances. Ranchers often relied upon natural boundaries rather than fences. The open range allowed enormous herds to move freely. But barbed wire changed that reality. Landowners could now fence property cheaply and effectively. Fields that had once been open became enclosed. Routes that cattle drives had used for years suddenly became blocked. The frontier was becoming divided into smaller pieces. For cowboys accustomed to the freedom of the open range, this represented a major transformation. The changes did not happen overnight. For a time, old and new systems existed side by side. Cattle drives continued. Ranches expanded. Railroads grew. Yet each year, more fences appeared. The landscape slowly changed. At the same time, railroads continued pushing farther into cattle country. This development created another challenge for the traditional cattle drive. In earlier years, herds often traveled hundreds of miles to reach railheads in Kansas. Now railroads increasingly reached closer to the ranches themselves. The long journeys that had once been necessary became less important. Why spend months driving cattle across the plains if trains could be reached much sooner? The economics of the industry began to shift. Ranchers adapted. Businesses adapted. And cowboys adapted as well. Nature also played a role in reshaping the West. The winter of 1886 and 1887 became infamous throughout cattle country. Many historians remember it as one of the harshest winters in Western history. Blizzards swept across the plains. Temperatures plunged. Snow covered the grasslands. Cattle struggled to find food. Thousands upon thousands of animals perished. Some estimates suggest that entire herds were lost. The disaster shocked ranchers. For years, many had believed the plains could support endless growth. The terrible winter demonstrated the limits of that assumption. The frontier remained powerful. Nature remained unpredictable. The lessons were expensive, and they were impossible to ignore. Following these hardships, many ranchers changed their methods. Open-range ranching gradually gave way to more controlled systems. Fences became increasingly common. Land use became more organized. The era of enormous free-roaming herds slowly faded. The cowboy did not disappear. Far from it. Cowboys continued working on ranches throughout the West. They continued caring for livestock. They continued riding horses. They continued performing difficult and essential work. But the nature of that work evolved. The great cattle drives became less common. The open range became smaller. The frontier itself became less wild. New towns appeared. New farms appeared. New industries emerged. The American West was becoming more settled. Many people living through these changes understood that an era was ending. The classic image of the cowboy driving cattle across endless grasslands belonged to a specific moment in history. It had not lasted very long. Yet it left a powerful impression on the national imagination. Stories spread. Books were written. Newspapers published accounts of frontier adventures. Eventually, motion pictures would carry these stories to audiences around the world. The legend began growing even as the reality faded. Ironically, many of the myths associated with cowboys became more popular after the Great Cattle Drive era had already begun to disappear. The real cowboys who had spent their lives battling dust, weather, exhaustion, and boredom often watched these stories with amusement. Their daily experiences had been far less dramatic, yet perhaps no less remarkable. They had helped build an industry. They had crossed enormous distances. They had worked in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Their achievements did not require constant gunfights to be impressive. As the century approached its end, the open range continued shrinking. Fences stretched across the prairie. Railroads connected distant communities. Settlements expanded. The frontier changed. And with it, the life of the cowboy changed as well. The great age of the long cattle drive was slowly drawing to a close. But its memory would endure. Long after the last major drives had ended. Long after the railheads had fallen silent. Long after the open prairie had been divided by fences. People would continue telling stories about the cowboys who once crossed those vast grasslands beneath the endless western sky. Did cowboys actually have gunfights? Separating legend from reality. And so, after following the cowboy from the early morning darkness, across dusty trails, through storms and river crossings, into frontier towns, and finally to the end of the open range, we arrive once again at the question that began our journey. Did cowboys actually have gunfights? The answer is both simple and complicated. Yes. Gunfights did occur. But they were far less common than popular culture would later suggest. For many people around the world, the cowboy is almost inseparable from the revolver. Movies often portray the American West as a place where armed men settled disputes through dramatic showdowns in dusty streets. The image is instantly recognizable. Two opponents standing face to face. Hands hovering near their holsters. A tense silence. A sudden draw. A bonus epilogue, a quiet night on the prairie. And now, as our journey through the American West draws to a close, let us imagine one final evening on the open prairie. The cattle have settled. The horses stand quietly nearby. The day's work is complete. The sun has disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a fading band of orange and gold. The air grows cooler. The endless grasslands that seemed so bright beneath the afternoon sun now begin to fade into darkness. For a cowboy, this was often the most peaceful time of day. The noise and movement of the trail gradually disappeared. The cattle no longer pushed forward. The chuck wagon had finished serving supper. The campfire burned low. Conversations became quieter. One by one, men rolled themselves into blankets beneath the open sky. There were no electric lights. No engines. No phones. No distant hum of modern life. Only the sounds of nature. A light breeze moving through the grass. The occasional call of a night bird. The soft shifting of cattle in the darkness. And above everything else, the stars. The night sky of the 19th century frontier was astonishing. Far from cities and artificial light, the heavens appeared almost impossibly bright. Thousands of stars filled the darkness. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a pale river of light. For many cowboys, these stars became familiar companions. Night after night, they looked upward at the same constellations, the same moon, the same distant worlds. Long before GPS or modern navigation systems, travelers often relied upon the sky itself. The stars offered guidance, but they also offered perspective. Beneath such a vast sky, human concerns could seem very small. The worries of the day gradually faded. Tomorrow's challenges belonged to tomorrow. For now, there was only the quiet prairie and the endless night. Perhaps this is one reason the American West continues to fascinate people today. Not because of gunfights. Not because of outlaws. Not because of dramatic showdowns in dusty streets. But because it represents something increasingly rare. Space. Silence. Distance. A world where the horizon seemed limitless. A world where a person could spend days surrounded by nothing but grasslands, sky, and weather. The reality was often difficult. The work was demanding. The conditions could be harsh. Yet there was also beauty. A kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly. A sunrise over the prairie. A herd moving through morning mist. A campfire glowing beneath the stars. Moments that rarely appeared in dime novels or Hollywood films. Yet moments that formed the true fabric of cowboy life. And so, as the campfire burns lower, and the stars wheel silently overhead, we leave the trail behind. The cattle drives have ended. The railheads have faded into history. The open range has largely disappeared. But the memory remains. The memory of men and horses crossing vast grasslands. The memory of long journeys measured not in hours, but in weeks. The memory of a quieter, slower world. A world of dust, weather, patience, and endurance. And perhaps, as sleep begins to draw near, we can picture that final scene one last time. A lonely campfire. A peaceful herd. A cowboy gazing upward at the stars. And beyond him, stretching into the darkness, the endless prairie. Good night.